giant scandal came out that could reform the entire financial sector of the entire world without any exaggeration. Factually, scientifically, could reform them. Biggest example of banking gone wrong is the LIBOR scandal. Now, Americans might not be that familiar with this, but it was big news in the UK when it happened, and I was there for that. And I was doing research there and working with all these different global institutions, and then this giant scandal came out that could reform the entire financial sector of the entire world without any exaggeration. Factually, scientifically, could reform them because the LIBOR rate and the London Stock Exchange and the Hong Kong and American ones, they're all interconnected on these rates, and that's the rate which banks lend to each other. So it affects student loans, all kinds of financial products, and every aspect of life, right, is affected by the LIBOR scandal, which is why in America it's illegal to affect it in any way, shape, or form. But they found out, guess what? In UK, in London, in one of the world's most powerful and historic stock exchanges, they found out that a group of a small tiny group of dudes having lunch together, having a little brunch, were changing the global stock market because they could change the LIBOR rate. And they would actually talk to the head of Barclays, which is a major bank there. It's kind of comparable to the size of Bank of America or one of these larger institutions. It's a big global bank. And Barclays was talking to them, and they were like, we're not having such a great quarter. If you bump up the rates, we'll help you out here. And what that does is it makes them look more creditworthy, or they're doing better on the books. It's a way of cooking the books. And it is incredibly illegal, and it has been done by a tiny handful of people. If ever there was a conspiracy theory, this was it. Because a handful of people that you can count on one hand were changing the entire world order financially. And that was because they had relied on these analysts, former bank execs, former financial head honcho guys, and nobody had checked in on them. They just kind of assumed that they were somehow legitimately determining this rate, looking at the last 3 months and trying to suss out what is the average rate at which banks are lending to each other. But no, they were just straight up emailing each other, asking for favors, and changing the entire financial sector. To give you an example of how big of a deal this was, it was $350 trillion. Guess how much America, the largest economy in the history of the world, makes on a yearly basis of GDP? 19 to 18. 18 and less back then. But nowadays, 19 point something. They were doing in the hundreds of trillions of dollars, affecting it by the LIBOR rate. The entire global financial sector was built on a house of sand. And, reporters have mentioned this on the Financial Times. It was probably the single biggest revelation on finances and money in the history of the world. And it was done casually because one of these guys emailed a reporter by accident, an email chain, because he's old and doesn't know how to use a computer properly, and emailed it to a reporter, a financial reporter, about how they were fixing the LIBOR rate. And they got caught, and they got fired, and they got a little slap on the wrist, and some people got some little penalties, but they were pretty much the biggest criminals in the history of the world that got caught. And most Americans never even heard of it. That's the problem with nationalism. Looking at the world in this tiny little window of how the world works, you don't see the bigger picture. The LIBOR rate fundamentally changed the world. These 4 or 5 guys basically were robbing the world's biggest bank, and nobody even understood it, because a long time ago, crooks learned if you make things complicated enough, ordinary people will never even bother to learn how it works, and they'll just let you steal as much as you want. All you gotta do is make it a few fancy words and a few fancy documents, and a couple lawyers who can take decades to just figure out how to read it. Most people will never bother, and so you can just take whatever you want, and that's what happened in the LIBOR rate. Negligence, fueled by decades of just assumptions that these guys were somehow doing it legitimately, never checking, no oversight, nothing of the sort. Of course, now there's some recommendations. Supposedly, they're supposed to be doing on the last 3 months averages, and then using analysts to try to figure out what that number should accurately be, and making it a criminal act to affect it. But that's way too late, and they've been doing it for hundreds of years, decades and decades and decades. These same individuals were doing it during your lifetime, taking more money than anyone had ever taken, and nobody even knew in America. It was small news. It was treated like, like a chipmunk skiing or something like that, like some little novelty video. Cat videos get more attention on YouTube than the biggest robbery in the history of the world, because it's complicated, because it has details, because it has legalese, and because, obviously news channels don't want to report how the entire financial sector was compromised by a couple of dudes having brunch. It doesn't really fit their interests to make it everyone worried about how unstable the financial world is. People want to have this illusion of security, especially when it comes to their money, their savings, their retirement, which, by the way, a screwy LIBOR rate can actually affect, because it affects all loans. It affects the rate which banks give each other money, which is how they get the money to give you your loan. So if they're charging you your loan too much or too little, that can affect the whole system. And it can affect your ability to survive or start a business or pay off a car loan or pay off a mortgage or, pay your student loans. All of these products, all of these things, these financial products, all these fundamental things of society were compromised by 5 guys. One email would change things that would dwarf any country in the world and their GDP. So there are good globalists, there are bad globalists, and there are incompetent globalists who have brunch and email reporters.